I'm going to read chapter 3 in which a conversation takes place, which seems likely to cause the Philleas to pull idea. Before reading chapter 3 and then I talk about chapter 2. And in chapter 2 and Portugal became servant for pre-Philleas call. And then, okay, so I'm going to read chapter 3.
World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, translated by George Makepeace Cowell. Chapter 3, in which a conversation takes place which seems likely to cost Phileas Fogg dear. Phileas Fogg, having shut the door of his house at 11:30, and having put his right foot before his left 575 times, and his left foot before his right 576 times, reached the Reform Club, an imposing edifice in Pall Mall, which could not have cost less than 3 millions.
He repaired at once to dining rooms to 9 windows, of which is often a tasteless garden, where the tree was already squeezed the autumn coloring into deck.
And took his place at the habitual table, the cover of which had already been laid for him.
As the breakfast consisted of a side dish at the broiled fish, which is the reading sauce and scarlet slice of roast beef, garnished with its mushrooms, flesh bar, gooseberry tart, and morsels of Cheshire cheese duffel.
Down several cups of tea, for which the Reform is famous.
He rolled at 13 minutes to 1, and then directly he steps toward the large hall at some terrace apartment adorned with it.
Uncut times, which he proceeded to cut with a skill which betrayed familiarity with this delicate operation.
The perusers of this paper observed that Philleas paused until the quarter to 4, which the standard his next task occupied him to the dinner hour.
Dinner passed as breakfast had done, and Mr. Fogg reappeared in the reading room and sat down to the Pall Mall at 20 minutes before 6.
Half an hour later, several members of the Reform came in and drew up to the fireplace, where a coal fire was steady running.
Mr. Fogg's usual partners at whist, Andrew Stuart, an engineer, John Sullivan and Samuel Fallentin, bankers, Thomas Flanagan, a brewer, and Gauthier Ralph, one of the directors of the Bank of England.
Rich and highly respected personages, the Evening Club, which comprised the princes of English trade dependents, Sir Thomas Flanagan, were rather lovely.
Cried Stuart. The bank will lose the money. On the contrary, broke in Ralph, I hope we may put our hands on the robber.
Skillful detectives have been sent to all the principal ports of America and the continent, and he'll be a clever fellow if he'll slip so through there.
Robber's description, asked Stuart. In the first place, he is no robber at all, returned Ralph positively.
What? A fellow who makes off with £55,000 in a robber? Perhaps he's a manufacturer then.
The Daily Telegraph says that he is a gentleman. It was Phileas Fogg, whose head now emerged from behind his newspapers, who made this remark.
He bowed his brain and entered into this conversation. The affairs which formed the subject and which was town talk had occurred 3 days before at the Bank of England.
A package of banknotes to the value of £55,000 had been taken from the principal cashier's table, that functionary being at the moment engaged in registering
the receipt of 3 shillings and 6pence. Of course he couldn't have his eyes everywhere.
Observed that the Bank of England reposes a touching confidence in the honesty of the public.
There was no aghast, nor grating to protect his treasures. The gold silver banknotes are freely exposed at a mixture of the first kind.
A keen observer of English customs relates that being in one of the rooms of the bank one day, he had the curiosity to examine a gold ingot weighing some 7 or 8 pounds.
He took it up, scrutinized it, passed it to his neighbor. It next man, so on until it ingot, going from end to end, and transferred in the dark.
Nor did it return to its place for half an hour. Meanwhile, the cashier had not so much as raised his head.
But in the present instance, things had not gone so smoothly.
Package of notes not being found when 5 o'clock sounded from the ponderous clock in the drawing office, the amount was passed to the account of profit and loss.
As soon as the robbery was discovered, I picked the detectives to hasten up to Liverpool Square, Glasgow, Sahara, Sujet, as in this New York and other first, inspired by the fact falsely worth £2,000.
£2,000 and 5% on the sum that might be recovered.
Detectives were also charged with the narrows watching those who left London by rail and judicial examination was advanced into
upon. There were real grounds for supposing, as the Daily Telegraph said, that the thief did not belong to a professional band.
On the day of the robbery, a well-dressed gentleman of polished demeanor, the widest well-to-do heirs that had been observed going to the poor in the venues where the crime was committed.
Morgan was easily procured and sent to the detectives, and some hopeful spirits, of whom Ralph was one, did not despair of his apprehension.
The papers and clubs were full of the affairs, and everywhere the people were discussing the probability of a successful pursuit. The Reform Club was
agitated, several of its members being bank officials.
While we do not concede the work of the detectives was likely to be in vain, for he thought that price of offered would greatly stimulate the due and activity.
But Stuart was far from sharing this confidence, and as they placed themselves at the whist table, they continued to argue the matter.
Stuart and Flanagan played together, while the first folk had the routine for his fortnight. As the games proceeded, the conversation ceased, except between the lovers when it revived again.
I maintain, said Stuart, that the chances are in favor of the thief, who must be a shrewd fellow. Well, but where can he fly to? Asked Ralph.
No country is safe from him. Sure. To where could he go then? Oh, I don't know. The world is big enough.
The world is big enough. It was once, said Philleas Fogg in a low tone. Cut, sir, he added, handing the cards to Thomas Flanagan.
The discussion fell during the lower words, after which Stuart took up his thread. What do you mean by once? Has the world grown smaller? Suddenly returned Ralph.
I agree with Mr. Fogg. The world has grown smaller, since a man can now go round it 10 times more quickly than 100 years ago.
And that is why the search for this thief will be more likely to succeed, and also is why the thieves can get away from it.
But there's to play, Mr. Stuart, said Phileas Fogg. But incredulous Stuart was not incumbent when the hand was finished said eagerly. You have a strange way, Ralph, of fooling that word. You can go round it in 3 months, in 80 days, interrupted Phileas Fogg. That is true, gentlemen, added John Sullivan.
Only 8 days. Now that the section between Lothal and Allahabad on the great Indian Peninsula Railways had been opened.
Made by the Daily Telegraph. From London to Suez via Montcenis and Brindisi by rail and steamboats, 7 days. From Suez to Bombay by steamer, 13 days.
From Bombay to Calcutta by rail, 3 days. From Calcutta to Hong Kong by steamer, 7 days. Hong Kong to Yokohama by steamer, 6 days.
Yokohama, Japan by steamer, 6 days. From Yokohama to San Francisco by steamer, 22 days. From San Francisco to New York by rail, 7 days.
From New York to London by steamer and rail, 9 days. Total 8 days.
Yes, in 80 days, exclaimed Stuart, who in his excitement made a false deal. But that doesn't take into account bad weather, contrary winds, shipwrecks, railway accidents, and so on.
Our encounter returns affairs continue to place this point of discussion.
But suppose the Hindus or Indians pull up the rails, replied Stuart. Suppose they stop the trains, pillage the luggage vans, and scalp the passengers.
Our inquiry calmly returned Poe, adding as he threw down the cards 2 trumps.
Stuart, whose turn it was to deal, gathered them up and went on. You were right, theoretically, Mr. Fogg, but practically also, Mr. Stuart. I'd like to see you do it in 80 days.
It depends on you. Sure you go. Heaven preserve me.
But I would wager £4,000 that such a journey made under these conditions is impossible. Quite possible, on the contrary, returned Mr. Fogg.
Well, make it then the journey around the world in 8 days. Yeah, I should like nothing better.
Would like nothing better. Then, at once. Only I warn you that I shall do it at your expense.
It's absurd, cried Stuart, who was beginning to be annoyed at the persistence of his friend. Come, let's go with it again. Deal over again? Said the pleased Fogg.
Deal. Stuart took up the pack with a feverish hand, then suddenly put them down again. Well, Mr. Fogg, said he, it shall be so. I will wager the 4,000 on it.
Calm yourself, my dear Stuart, said the foreigner. It's only a joke. When I say I'll wager, return Stuart, I mean it,
said Mr. Fogg, and turning to the others, he continued. I have a deposit of 20,000 at Barings, which I will willingly risk upon it. £20,000, cried Sullivan.
£20,000, which you would lose by a single accidental delay. The unforeseen does not exist, qualified Philleas Fogg.
Philleas Fogg. But, Mr. Fogg, 80 days are only the estimate of the least possible time in which the journey can be made. A well-used minimum suffices for everything.
But in order not to exceed, you must jump mathematically from the trains up on the streamers, and from the streamers up on the trains again. I'll jump mathematically.
You're joking. A true Englishman doesn't joke when he is talking about so serious a thing as a wager, replied Phileas Fogg solemnly.
I'll back £20,000 against anyone who wishes that I'll also make a tour over the world in 8 days or less, in 1990. 20 hours.
1,200 minutes. Do you accept? We accept, replied Mr. Stuart.
Stalin, Sullivan, Farragon, and Rare, after consulting each other. Good, said Miss Brower. The train leaves for Dover at 9:15.
I will take it. This very evening? Asked Stuart. This very evening, returned Phileas Fogg.
They took out and consulted the pockets and Armani, and added that today is Wednesday and the 2nd of October. I shall be due in London in this room of the poems cropped on Saturday, 20th of December.
1st of December at 9:15 p.m. Or else the £20,000 now deposited in my name at Barings will belong to you in fact and in right, gentlemen. Here is a check for the amount.
A memorandum of the wager was at once drawn up and signed at the board of 6 parties, the doings which Philleas Fogg was thought composer.
Not bet to win, and would only stake the £20,000, half of his fortune, because he foresaw that he might have to expend the other half to carry out.
Carry out is difficult enough to say it's an unattainable project.
As for his antagonists, they seemed much agitated, not so much by the value of their stake, as because they had some scruples about betting under conditions so difficult to their friend.
The clock struck 7 and Paul offered to suspend the game so that Mr. Fogg might make these preparations for departure.
Quite ready now, was his tranquil response. Diamonds or trumps? Be so good as to play, gentlemen.
Yeah? Alright, interesting. Stuart and Philleas Fogg talk about traveling London to London, from London to London. Interesting. In 80 days, and then Dover, and India, and Hong Kong to Yokohama, Yokohama to San Francisco, railway, and New York to London in 80 days. From October to December 21st. Okay, so interesting.